Ah, Ravishing Rick Rude, the man who could make your girlfriend blush, your dad mad, and your dog confused, all in one pelvic thrust. With his chiseled physique, feathered hair that looked like it was blow-dried by Zeus himself, and promos smoother than a Barry White slow jam, Rude, he wasn't just a heel, he was an art installation in mustachioed arrogance. But behind those gyrating hips and that smirk painted in ego, Rick Rude was as old school as it got. He had a deep respect for the craft of wrestling, and even deeper contempt for anyone who dared make a mockery of it. Rude didn't suffer fools, phonies, or flippy guys who looked like they belonged more in a roller disco than a wrestling ring. While fans swooned at his abs, Rude's peers had to deal with his wrath if they failed the litmus test of toughness and professionalism. He wasn't just a worker's worker, he was a worker with a temper and a Rolodex of grudges. And boy, did he have grudges. Whether it was a lack of ring psychology, a stiff clothesline, or just having a face that annoyed him, Rude could develop heat quicker than a Florida summer. This video dives into 5 men who made Rude's metaphorical and sometimes literal hit list. We're not talking playful backstage ribs or creative differences here. No, these were wrestlers who Rick Rude outright hated working with. Let's dig in. First up is the most obvious entry, the Ultimate Warrior, the cosmic snorting neon tornado of roid rage and warrior wisdom. If Rick Rude's wrestling was symphonic, Warrior's was, well, someone falling down the stairs in full face paint. Their feud in the late 80s was legendary, and their matches were box office gold. But backstage, it was like trying to mix champagne and gasoline. Rick Rude loathed working with Warrior. Why? Because Warrior was as stiff as a refrigerator, couldn't sell a punch to save his life, and had the in-ring psychology of a sledgehammer. Rude prided himself on making matches look good, even if it meant bumping like he was hit by a meteor. But Warrior wasn't selling unless you hit him with a forklift and a tax audit. During their SummerSlam 1989 match for the Intercontinental title, Rude carried Warrior to what many call Warrior's best match ever. Rude was bumping like a lunatic, trying to make Warrior look like a god instead of a man with a protein shake for a brain. But Warrior was careless, infamously so. He'd potato guys with wild clotheslines, missed spots, and gas, out faster than a Dollar Tree lawnmower. Rude took issue with this. He was old school, trained by Eddie Sharkey, and believed in respecting your opponent. Warrior didn't just disrespect that, he ignored it entirely. Backstage, Rude had reportedly refused to work with Warrior again after their run ended. He once told friends that Warrior was an unprofessional clown in war paint. Considering Rude once wrestled a match with his tights featuring Cheryl Roberts' face on his butt, that's saying something. Let's shift gears to a different kind of nightmare. Big Van Vader. Now, Rude respected tough guys. He loved hard-hitting wrestling when it had rhythm and flow. But Vader was a monster truck with bricks for fists and tunnel vision. If you didn't fight Vader's way, you were going to get steamrolled. Their time together in WCW was brief but bumpy. Vader was a stiff son of a gun, and Rude, he hated that. While Vader was laying in forearms like he was trying to tenderize steak, Rude wanted matches to look brutal without requiring dental records afterward. In one backstage story, Rude apparently confronted Vader after a tag match, where Vader had landed an errant shot to Rude's jaw. Rude didn't scream or yell, he just calmly told Vader, "You throw one more potato, I'm throwing back a receipt with interest." Vader reportedly laughed. Rude? He never. That was the thing. Rick Rude could fight. He wasn't just some posing pretty boy. This was a guy who once knocked out a drunk guy in a bar for disrespecting Kurt Hennig. You didn't want to push Rude too far. Their styles never meshed. Rude wanted structure. Vader wanted carnage. Together it was like trying to choreograph a ballet with a rhinoceros. Rude never named Vader in public, but insiders always knew. Behind the curtain, he thought Vader was reckless, selfish, and more interested in showing off than telling a story. For Rude, that was wrestling sacrilege. Now here's a curveball. Ric Flair. On paper, you'd think these two would be besties. Both were Minnesota guys, both world-class workers, both part of the ultra-cocky, ultra-slick wrestler archetype. But Rick Rude didn't exactly love Nature Boy. In fact, he didn't even really like him. Why? Because while Flair lived his gimmick 24/7, Rolexes, limos, women, and woo, Rude was actually a family man underneath the oily exterior. And he couldn't stand Flair's backstage politics. Rude once famously said, "Ric Flair is great in the ring, but he's greater at stabbing you in the back." They clashed during their WCW feud in 1993-1994, which started hot but fizzled fast. Flair, by then, had creative control and was still seen as the guy. Rude, on the other hand, was trying to build his own main event legacy. The two had completely different visions of their feud. Rude wanted a gritty, serious blood war. Flair wanted robe twirls and backstage skits. Things came to a head when Rude felt Flair intentionally no-sold a few of his spots on live TV. Not enough to be obvious, but just enough to make Rude look second-rate. Rude was livid. It wasn't hatred in the Warrior sense. It was more like contempt dressed in respect, like someone shaking your hand while wearing brass knuckles. If there was one Four Horseman who didn't belong, it was Paul Roma, and nobody believed that more than Rick Rude. In the early 90s, WCW, being the master of bad decisions, decided to slot Roma into the iconic Horseman faction alongside Flair and Arn Anderson. It was like putting mayonnaise on sushi, completely out of place and offensive to anyone with taste. Rude, working in WCW at the time, had no filter when it came to Roma. He saw him as a mid-card pretty boy with nothing to back it up. Rude thought Roma was all look, no work, and worse, arrogant about it. They only shared the ring a few times, but each encounter was described as tense. Rude didn't trust Roma to keep up, and Roma felt Rude was being a prima donna. There's an infamous story from a backstage taping where Rude flat out said, "Get this jobber out of my match," after Roma botched a spot in rehearsal. Roma heard it. Things almost got physical. Cooler heads prevailed, but Rude had never stopped burying him behind the scenes. In a shoot interview years later, Rude allegedly told a friend, "I've met mannequins with more charisma than Paul Roma." And knowing Rude, he probably suplexed one just to prove it. Rick Rude respected Davey Boy Smith when he was in his prime. But when Bulldog returned to WWE in 1999, wearing jeans and looking like a bouncer at a Weatherspoons, Rude couldn't hide his disappointment. They never had a marquee feud, but Rude and Bulldog crossed paths enough in the early 90s for mutual respect to build. However, by the late 90s, Bulldog had deteriorated, both physically and mentally. His back was shot, his timing was off, and the painkillers were flowing. Rude, working backstage in WWE as an enforcer of sorts, hated seeing guys go out there and stink up the joint. And Bulldog, unfortunately, was stinking it up bad. He reportedly tried to help Davey Boy, gave him tips, encouraged rehab, but when Bulldog blew off the advice and continued limping through matches, Rude gave up. He told agents, "If I have to lay out another match for this zombie, I'm walking." It wasn't hate from ego, it was hate from heartbreak. Rude couldn't stand seeing one of the greats become a shell of himself. Rick Rude was never one to fake a smile. He wasn't a company yes man. He was a professional who demanded professionalism. In an era filled with big muscles, bigger egos, and steroid-soaked promos, Rude somehow managed to maintain credibility without losing his sanity. Most of the time. He didn't hate for the sake of it. He hated working with people who didn't take the craft seriously, who didn't want to tell a story, who didn't care about their opponent's safety. Whether it was Warrior's chaos, Vader's recklessness, Flair's politics, Roma's mediocrity, or Bulldog's sad decline. Rude had reasons for every grudge he held, and maybe that's why he's still remembered with such respect. Because behind the abs, the attitude, and the airbrushed tights was a wrestler who cared, deeply, even if that care came wrapped in a threat and a right hook. Rick Rude, he died too young. But his legacy lives on, partly because of who he was, and partly because of who he refused to be. He wasn't just ravishing, he was real. And in the world of wrestling, that's more rare than a polite Ultimate Warrior promo. Thanks for watching.